New York City has a rich history and has played a significant role in many important events throughout the years. Here are 10 historic events that have shaped the city. 1. The Dutch founding of New Amsterdam. In 1624, the Dutch founded New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. The Dutch founded New Amsterdam in 1624 as a trading post and settlement on the southern tip of Manhattan Island in present-day New York City. The settlement was established by the Dutch West India Company, which had been granted a charter by the Dutch government to trade and establish colonies in the region. New Amsterdam was the capital of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which included parts of present-day New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut. The settlement was named after the Dutch capital, Amsterdam, and was intended to serve as a hub for Dutch trade and commerce in the region. The Dutch West India Company sent 30 families to establish the settlement and appointed a governor, Peter Minuit, to oversee the colony. The settlement quickly grew, attracting more Dutch settlers and a diverse population of Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. In 1664, the English seized control of New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. Despite the change in ownership, the Dutch influence on the city and its culture remains strong to this day, with many streets and landmarks in New York City bearing Dutch names and the city's iconic architecture influenced by Dutch design. This event marked the beginning of the city's long and diverse history. 2. The American Revolution. New York City played a key role in the American Revolution, serving as a center for the Patriots and hosting many important events, including the reading of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. The American Revolution was a significant event in the history of the United States, in which the 13 British colonies on the eastern coast of North America declared their independence from Great Britain and established themselves as a new nation. The conflict, which lasted from 1775 to 1783, was fought between the American colonists and the British Army, with the colonists eventually achieving victory and establishing the United States of America. New York City played a crucial role in the American Revolution. The city was a major center of trade and commerce, and was strategically located along the East Coast, making it a key target for both the British and the Americans. During the early years of the Revolution, the British Army occupied New York City and used it as a base of operations. The city was the site of several key battles, including the Battle of Brooklyn and the Battle of White Plains. The Americans also launched several attacks on the city, including the successful capture of Fort Ticonderoga and the unsuccessful attack on Quebec. After the war, New York City became the capital of the United States and served as the site of George Washington's inauguration as the first president of the United States in 1789. The city continued to play a significant role in the nation's history, serving as a hub of trade, commerce, and politics throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. 3. The draft riots of 1863. During the Civil War, New York City was the site of the draft riots, a series of violent protests against the Union Army's draft policies. The riots resulted in the deaths of at least 119 people and caused widespread destruction in the city. The draft riots of 1863, also known as the New York City Draft Riots, were a series of violent attacks that occurred in New York City in July 1863 during the American Civil War. The riots were sparked by anger over the recently enacted Conscription Act, which required able-bodied men between the ages of 20 and 45 to register for military service in the Union Army. The draft was deeply unpopular among many working-class and immigrant communities in New York City, who saw it as a burden on their already difficult lives. Many of these people were also opposed to the Civil War and did not support the Union cause. The riots began on July 13, 1863, and quickly escalated into a full-scale uprising. Angry mobs attacked draft offices and burned buildings, including the Colored Orphan Asylum. They also targeted African Americans, whom they saw as competing for jobs and resources. Many African Americans were beaten and killed, and their homes and businesses were destroyed. The riots continued for several days, and it took a significant deployment of federal troops and state militia to quell the unrest. In the end, at least 120 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. The draft riots of 1863 were a major turning point in the Civil War and had significant consequences for the Union cause and the nation as a whole. 4. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. In 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was completed, connecting Brooklyn and Manhattan and becoming a symbol of the city's engineering and technological achievements. The Brooklyn Bridge is an iconic landmark in New York City, spanning the East River and connecting the boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn. The bridge was designed by John Augustus Roebling, a German-born engineer, and was completed in 1883. Construction on the Brooklyn Bridge began in 1869 and took 14 years to complete. The bridge was built using a novel design that used both cable-stayed and suspension principles. It was the first bridge in the world to use these technologies, and it was a major engineering feat at the time. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge was a major undertaking, and it required the use of several innovative techniques and technologies. Roebling and his team used pneumatic caissons, which were large, airtight chambers that allowed workers to dig deep foundations for the bridge's towers. These caissons were filled with compressed air to keep the water out and allow workers to dig in dry conditions. Despite these innovations, the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge was not without challenges. Many workers died during the construction process, including Roebling himself, who died from tetanus after a ferry crushed his foot while he was surveying the site. Despite these setbacks, the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge was ultimately a success, and it has become an iconic symbol of New York City and a major tourist attraction. It is considered one of the greatest engineering achievements in American history. 5. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. In 1911, a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in Manhattan resulted in the deaths of 146 garment workers, many of whom were young immigrant women. The tragedy led to significant reforms in labor and safety laws and spurred the growth of the labor movement in the city. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was a tragic industrial disaster that occurred in New York City on March 25, 1911. The fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a garment factory located in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of Manhattan. The factory employed mostly young, immigrant women and was known for its poor working conditions. The fire started on the 8th floor of the factory and quickly spread, engulfing the entire building. Many of the workers were trapped inside the factory because the doors had been locked to prevent them from taking breaks or stealing fabric. As a result, 146 people, mostly women and girls, died in the fire. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire was a major turning point in the history of labor rights in the United States. It brought attention to the terrible working conditions faced by many factory workers and sparked a movement for labor reform. The disaster led to the creation of new laws and regulations to improve factory safety, and it played a role in the development of the modern labor movement in the United States. 6. The Great Depression. New York City was hit hard by the Great Depression, with high levels of unemployment and poverty. The city's response to the crisis, including the construction of public works projects such as the New York City subway, helped to stimulate the economy and laid the foundation for the city's future growth. The Great Depression was a major economic downturn that occurred in the United States and around the world in the 1930s. It was the longest and most severe depression in the history of the modern industrialized world, and it had a profound impact on many aspects of society, including politics, culture, and daily life. New York City was particularly hard hit by the Great Depression. The city was a major financial and economic hub, and it was heavily reliant on the stock market and the financial industry. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the city's economy was severely impacted. Many businesses closed, and unemployment soared. The Great Depression had a devastating effect on New York City. Many people lost their jobs and homes, and poverty and homelessness were widespread. Soup kitchens and bread lines became a common sight, and the city's infrastructure was stretched to the breaking point. Despite the challenges, New York City did not give up. The city's residents and leaders worked together to try to find ways to address the crisis. The New Deal, a series of programs and policies enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, provided some relief to the city, but it took the United States' entry into World War II to fully bring the country out of the Depression. The war brought new jobs and industry to the city, and by the end of the war, New York City had regained its position as a major economic and cultural center. 7. The World Trade Center. The first World Trade Center attack occurred on February 26, 1993, when a truck bomb exploded in the underground parking garage of the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The attack was carried out by a group of terrorists with links to Islamic extremist groups, and it resulted in the deaths of 6 people and the injury of over 1,000 others. The attack caused significant damage to the North Tower and the surrounding area, and it caused the evacuation of thousands of people from the World Trade Center complex. The attack was a major security breach and a major shock to the city of New York and the nation as a whole. The first World Trade Center attack was the first major act of terrorism on U.S. soil in the modern era, and it marked a significant shift in the way the United States thought about and prepared for the threat of terrorism. It also led to significant changes in national security and counterterrorism policy, including the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The attack was ultimately overshadowed by the more devastating attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, which resulted in the collapse of the Twin Towers and the deaths of nearly 3,000 people. However, the first World Trade Center attack was an important moment in the history of terrorism and national security, and it had a lasting impact on the way the United States and the world view and respond to the threat of terrorism. Attacks. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked 8. The Stonewall Riots, in 1969, a series of protests and demonstrations in Greenwich Village, known as the Stonewall Riots, marked a turning point in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights and helped to launch the modern LGBTQ+ civil rights movement. The Stonewall Riots were a series of demonstrations and protests that occurred in the Greenwich Village neighborhood of New York City in the early hours of June 28, 1969. The protests were sparked by a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in the neighborhood. At the time, homosexuality was illegal in many parts of the United States, and gay bars were frequently targeted by law enforcement. The raid on the Stonewall Inn was part of a wider crackdown on homosexuality and the gay community, and it resulted in the arrest of several patrons of the bar. The raid and the arrest sparked outrage among the patrons of the bar and the surrounding community, who began to protest and demonstrate outside the bar. The protests quickly escalated into a full-scale riot, with people throwing objects and clashing with police. The Stonewall Riots were a major turning point in the history of the LGBTQ+ rights movement in the United States. They galvanized the gay community and sparked a wider movement for LGBTQ+ rights and equality. The riots are now seen as the beginning of the modern gay rights movement, and they are celebrated every year on June 28 as the anniversary of the Stonewall Riots. 9. The blackout of 1977. On July 13, 1977, a massive blackout caused by a lightning strike and equipment failure left most of New York City without power for over 24 hours. The blackout resulted in widespread looting and vandalism and was a major crisis for the city. The blackout of 1977 was a major power outage that occurred in New York City on July 13, 1977. The blackout was caused by a series of failures in the city's power grid and affected most of the city, including all 5 boroughs. The blackout began at around 9:30 p.m. and lasted for approximately 25 hours. It caused widespread disruption and chaos in the city, as many people were left without electricity and transportation. The blackout also resulted in a significant amount of looting and vandalism, as people took advantage of the darkness to steal and destroy property. The blackout of 1977 had a major impact on the city of New York and its residents. It brought attention to the city's aging infrastructure and the need for upgrades and improvements. It also highlighted the importance of emergency preparedness and the need for backup plans in the event of a disaster. The blackout also had a lasting impact on the city's culture and identity. It is remembered as a defining moment in the city's history and has been referenced in popular culture, including in music, literature, and film. 10. The September 11 attacks. On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked and crashed 2 planes into the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan, killing nearly 3,000 people and causing widespread destruction. The attacks had a profound impact on the city and the nation and continue to shape our world today. On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and crashed them into the World Trade Center in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a field in Pennsylvania. The attacks, which were perpetrated by the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda, resulted in the deaths of nearly 3,000 people and caused significant damage to the World Trade Center and the surrounding area. The attacks on the World Trade Center were the most devastating of the three. The planes crashed into the Twin Towers, the two main buildings of the World Trade Center complex, causing both towers to collapse. The attacks also caused significant damage to other buildings in the complex, including the Marriott Hotel and 7 World Trade Center. The attacks on the World Trade Center were a major turning point in the history of the United States and the world. They resulted in significant changes to national security and foreign policy, and they had a profound impact on the way people around the world view terrorism and the threat it poses. The attacks also had a lasting impact on the city of New York, where the World Trade Center had been an iconic and beloved symbol of the city's skyline. The attacks in their aftermath were a major trauma for the city and its residents, and they left a lasting scar on the city and the nation. These are just a few examples of significant historical events in New York City. The city has a rich and varied history and has played a central role in many important events throughout the years.